Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back into the late medieval streets, narrow, crooked lanes where the smell of tallow smoke mixes with roasting chestnuts, where shadows stretch long against half-timbered walls, and every creak of a shutter could be mistaken for something supernatural. You imagine the torches flickering in iron brackets, making faces look half saint, half demon, depending on the angle. You hear boots crunch on straw and see the glowing eyes of a cat that probably knows more about the underworld than any priest will admit. And remember, if you'd actually lived here, you probably wouldn't survive this night. Between the plague, the pickpockets, and the rumors that madness spreads like a curse. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're watching from bed, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing exactly when and where you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The streets around you buzz with gossip. One woman says her neighbor's son went mad after staring too long at the moon. Another insists her cousin's husband only lost his mind because he ate too much saffron. And then there's the priest, who says all of it boils down to sin, that despair itself is a kind of disobedience. You stand at the intersection of all these voices, realizing that medieval people didn't have a neat box labeled mental health. Instead, they blurred it across religion, medicine, morality, and myth. You shuffle past a candle-lit apothecary, jars glinting with powders you probably don't want to sniff too closely. In one, dried rose petals for calming a restless heart. In another, ground skull powder, yes, actual skull, which someone swears will ward off nightmares. Historians still argue whether people really believed in the potency of these powders or just went along because it gave them some sense of control. Either way, you'd better not sneeze in here or you'll owe more than your week's wages. A few steps further, and you find yourself beside a tavern door. Inside, laughter roars as men drown their sorrows in ale so thick you could probably stand a spoon in it. One slams his mug down and declares his brother's melancholy could be cured if he just married the brewer's daughter. That's one solution, I guess, though probably not recommended by physicians. You can't help but notice how humor, little jokes, half-serious advice, was itself a kind of medieval therapy. People shared tales, teased one another, even mocked madness, perhaps as a way of coping with its terrifying reality. As you wander deeper into the city, you pass beggars huddled in doorways. Some rock back and forth, muttering prayers or curses you can't quite make out. To onlookers, they're not just poor but dangerous, their madness seen as contagious or a sign of divine punishment. And here's the twist. Some of those same beggars will, by morning, find a sympathetic soul who believes their mutterings are visions from God. One moment lunatic, the next a prophet, medieval society could flip that script faster than a YouTube algorithm. You pause under the looming cathedral, its bells tolling the hour. Inside, you imagine a man brought before the altar, not for confession but because his family believes a demon claws at his mind. The priest sprinkles holy water, chanting Latin that echoes off stone while the man's body trembles. Is it epilepsy? Trauma? A mental illness we diagnose differently today? No one here knows. All they know is that it looks terrifying, and in the absence of neurology textbooks, possession is the most convincing explanation. And to be fair, if you'd lived in a world where illness and the supernatural constantly overlapped, you'd probably agree. One of the quirkiest beliefs you overhear from a passerby, that simply staring at certain animals could drive you mad. Owls, for example, or even a hare sprinting across your path. The logic: both creatures were tied to witches or restless spirits, so if you're keeping score, medieval mental health hazards included. Moonlight, saffron, owls, hares, and, oh yes, your own bad habits. Suddenly your stress eating at midnight doesn't seem so bad, does it? Further along, you hear a street preacher warning that despair is the devil's favorite door into the soul. He insists that those who give in to sadness risk eternal damnation. And this is where things get particularly tough for the medieval patient. Because not only are you suffering internally, but society tells you your suffering is sinful. That's like being handed depression and then handed a guilt coupon on top. Yet strangely, some people took comfort in that framing. If despair was a sin, then forgiveness was possible. You weren't broken beyond repair. You just needed confession, penance, maybe a pilgrimage to knock things back into balance. The more you wander, the more you realize. Medieval streets themselves acted as a kind of open-air therapy session. Public life was crowded, loud, unavoidable. Everyone saw everyone else's business. And while that sounds suffocating, it also meant that personal struggles rarely stayed private. Families, neighbors, priests, guild masters, they all weighed in on your mental state whether you wanted them to or not. Sometimes helpful, sometimes catastrophic. Kind of like the medieval version of unsolicited advice in your DMs. Now, as the night deepens, the city grows quieter. Only the occasional watchman clanks by, lantern swinging. You imagine the lonely hours stretching when the mind feels most fragile. Insomnia was feared as both symptom and cause of madness. Doctors prescribed warm milk mixed with honey or placing rosemary under your pillow. But others warned that if you couldn't sleep, it was because your conscience was guilty. Try telling that to someone just anxious about tomorrow's tax collector. One last image before this section closes. A woman leaning from her window, whispering into the dark. Is she praying? Is she speaking to spirits? Is she simply lonely? Her neighbors might label her mad or mystical or both. And you see how impossible it was in medieval times to untangle mental health from the noisy swirl of religion, medicine, superstition, and sheer human need. You rub your hands together against the chill, stepping away from the cathedral shadows, and the street carries you toward the smell of boiled herbs and candle wax. A physician's chamber waits just around the corner, not the polished white-tiled space you might imagine, but a cluttered study stuffed with scrolls, jars, and the faintly unsettling presence of a bleeding bowl still sticky from earlier. This is where you first hear the word whispered in low tones: humors. In the medieval mind, your health, body, soul, and mind swirled together like soup in a cauldron. 4 ingredients made you who you were: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much of one. You're flushed, impulsive, maybe downright aggressive. Too much of another. You're sluggish, despairing, or weeping into your stale bread. You don't need tick-tock self-diagnosis when the entire framework of human psychology has already been boiled down into 4 squishy liquids sloshing around inside you. The doctor in front of you wears a fur-lined robe, though the room itself reeks of sweat and ink. He insists that your melancholy comes from an excess of black bile. You tilt your head, wondering where exactly this black bile hides in your body. Does it slosh in your liver or pool in your brain? He doesn't care about the specifics. To him, the proof is in the way you sigh too much, stare out the window, and refuse to laugh at his not-so-funny jokes. Melancholic, he declares, scribbling a note that looks more like chicken scratch than medical wisdom. Historians still argue whether medieval people literally believed they could measure these humors, or if it was more a metaphorical language for explaining things no one could otherwise pin down. Either way, the idea stuck for centuries. And honestly, you can see the appeal. The humors gave ordinary people a vocabulary for why they felt restless, sad, or angry. Imagine being told, "You're not cursed, you're just a little out of balance." Add some lettuce, cut back on wine, bleed a little at the wrist, you'll be fine. Sounds ridiculous, sure, but at least it wasn't pure doom. The doctor's apprentice, a lanky young man with ink-stained fingers, flips open a parchment showing a diagram of the zodiac man. Each body part ruled by a star sign, each humor tied to the heavens. He jabs his finger at the liver, associated with fiery Aries, and warns you not to let your black bile run rampant under the wrong constellation. So yes, your mental health now depends not just on your inner liquids, but on the alignment of the stars. Mercury retrograde suddenly seems tame in comparison. You lean back against a table where jars of herbs line up like soldiers: sage, rosemary, lavender. Each plant chosen not because it's proven in double-blind studies, but because centuries of trial, error, and a sprinkle of myth suggest they soothe the heart or sharpen the mind. You breathe in lavender and feel calmer, though maybe that's just placebo. But here's the thing. Placebo itself can heal, and medieval healers, knowingly or not, tapped into that truth. A patient stumbles in, clutching his head. He moans about voices whispering to him, driving him to madness. The doctor listens, nods gravely, and prescribes a balance-restoring regimen. Bleed the patient, feed him cold foods to counteract overheated blood, and perhaps, if he can afford it, send him to the countryside for fresh air and quiet. You recognize the mix: a little bit of real rest, a lot of questionable science, and a heavy dose of ritual that convinces the patient he's being cared for. Meanwhile, the apprentice mutters that too much phlegm can dull the mind. He points at you, joking that your yawn proves it. Maybe you're just tired, maybe you're a phlegmatic type destined to be sluggish, thoughtful, and a little boring. He grins, and you realize humor itself was part of the humors. People loved slotting each other into categories: melancholic poets, sanguine lovers, choleric warriors. It was part astrology, part personality quiz, and part early psychology. Who needs BuzzFeed when you've got Galen? You shuffle closer to the physician's shelf, where medical texts copied painstakingly by monks rest under wax seals. You catch glimpses of Greek names: Hippocrates, Galen, preserved through Arabic translations and brought back into Europe like treasures. These old authorities gave legitimacy to the whole system. Without them, bleeding someone until they faint might look suspiciously like cruelty. With them, it looked like science. And yet whispers drift through the chamber. Not everyone agreed with this humor theory. Some skeptics, rare but bold, suggested that madness came from external causes: shock, grief, trauma. A soldier returned from war might tremble not because his black bile overflowed, but because his mind simply couldn't bear the memories. That idea, radical for its time, flickered in the background, waiting for centuries later when it would finally take root. For now, though, you watch as a perfectly respectable citizen gets a vein opened in the name of balance. The bleeding bowl glints in the firelight, and you can't help but shudder. Imagine being told your depression is basically a plumbing issue, and the fix is to drain some of your life out. The doctor hums a tune while the apprentice presses claws, and you look away quickly, focusing instead on the herbal shelf. There, tucked between jars of mint and fennel, is a curious one labeled powder of viper. Yes, someone somewhere thought ground snake was just the thing to fix melancholy. If nothing else, it would distract you from your sadness. Out on the street again, you hear townsfolk debating humors in everyday language. One man blames his neighbor's temper on too much yellow bile. A woman sighs that her daughter is melancholic and needs a dose of honey water. Even the baker cracks jokes about sanguine customers who can't stop flirting while buying bread. You realize the humors weren't just medical, they were cultural shorthand. A shared code, making sense of everything from personality to madness. Here's a quirky tidbit you overhear at the market. Some people believe cheese, especially if eaten at the wrong phase of the moon, could tip your humors out of balance and send you spiraling into madness. So yes, your midnight grilled cheese could have been considered a health hazard in the 14th century, and people wonder why medieval life expectancy wasn't great. As you walk, you pass a well where women fill their buckets and gossip. One mutters that her cousin went melancholic after eating too many cucumbers. Another insists it's because he skipped church. And a third shakes her head, saying it was written in the stars. You smile at the way these explanations all braid together: diet, sin, and destiny forming a tangled knot. Night deepens, and you find yourself reflecting on this strange theory of humors. It feels absurd, yes, but you can't dismiss the way it gave people comfort. To be told that your madness wasn't pure punishment from heaven, but an imbalance that could be fixed, was oddly hopeful. And isn't that what so much of mental health treatment, even now, boils down to? Finding frameworks that give you hope, that make your suffering feel manageable. You pause by a shuttered stall, listening to a drunk mutter about his black bile. He swears the only cure is more ale. You chuckle, realizing that medieval people like us didn't always follow the doctor's advice. Sometimes they self-medicated, sometimes they ignored it, sometimes they laughed it off. The humors may have been the official doctrine, but the human response was always more complicated. As you step away, the doctor's words echo in your head. Balance, balance, balance. 4 humors, 4 fluids, 4 ways your mind could tilt out of line. It's both comforting and limiting. Comforting because it gave every sadness a name. Limiting because it trapped every sadness inside a narrow box. You wonder how many medieval souls lay awake, restless, knowing something was wrong but unable to find the words outside of bile and blood. The city noises fade behind you as you wander uphill toward the monastery. The air sharpens here, carrying the scent of beeswax candles and freshly tilled soil from the monastic gardens. You step through an arched doorway into a cloister where stone walls echo with footsteps, and suddenly the atmosphere shifts, quieter, weightier, like someone turned down the volume of the world. Inside these walls, the mind was supposed to find peace. And yet, if you linger too long, you'll notice that not every monk walking past looks serene. Some shuffle, sigh, or stare blankly at the floor as though carrying invisible stones in their robes. This is where you meet the medieval diagnosis of acedia, sometimes called the noonday demon. Imagine it. You're supposed to be chanting prayers, but instead you feel restless, heavy, maybe even apathetic. The bell tolls for vespers and you groan instead of rising. Your brothers pray, but your heart feels hollow. Today we might call it depression, burnout, or anxiety. Back then it was branded a spiritual sickness. A demon that whispered, "What's the point?" A monk brushes past you, clutching his psalter and muttering against those whispers. His brothers may scold him, urging him to confess his weakness. Yet they too knew the tug of fatigue. Some called it sloth, others a temptation from Satan, but the experience was universal. And here's the curious part. Historians still argue whether acedia was truly seen as a mental affliction or simply as moral failure. Was the struggling monk sick or sinful? You realize the answer depended less on his feelings and more on how his community interpreted them. In one corner of the cloister, an older monk sits hunched over a manuscript. He's copying out the works of Cassian, a 5th century theologian who described acedia in almost poetic detail. You peek over his shoulder and read, "A mind torpid, listless, and unable to do anything." Sound familiar? He may as well be describing the sensation of doom-scrolling your phone at 3 in the morning. Except here, there's no Wi-Fi, only the relentless drip of water echoing in the cloister well. But don't think these monks had it easy. Their routines were brutal, rising at midnight for matins, fasting, hours of silence. Sleep deprivation, isolation, and monotonous diets would crack anyone's mental resilience. You're practically yawning just imagining it. And when one monk broke down, refusing to sing or staring at the wall through the entire psalm, the others might interpret it as laziness, or worse, as a sign that the devil had crept into the community. You trail behind a novice into the dormitory. The beds are simple wooden planks with straw-filled mattresses. One young monk tosses restlessly, pulling the blanket over his head. He whispers about terrifying dreams, visions of demons, of being dragged to hell. His brothers might comfort him, or they might haul him to the prior for discipline. Because in this world, bad dreams weren't just bad sleep hygiene. They could be proof of spiritual warfare. And yet, tucked inside all this severity, you glimpse something gentler. A kindly infirmera, the monk in charge of healthcare, sits beside another brother who cannot stop weeping. He places a hand on his shoulder, murmuring prayers, then offers a warm drink laced with herbs from the monastery garden. Valerian for calm, chamomile for comfort. In that moment, the line between medical and spiritual care blurs. It's both therapy and theology, tea and blessing in one. You step into the scriptorium, the air thick with ink and concentration. Here, some monks pour themselves into work to stave off melancholy, copying letters, illuminating manuscripts, channeling their unease into art. You notice a margin doodle of a grinning snail fighting a knight. Was that a joke? A release of tension? Maybe. Even in the solemnity of monastic life, humor slipped through. It was its own kind of medicine. Historians still debate whether monks experienced higher rates of what we call depression because of their lifestyle, or whether monasteries simply offered a rare, written record of it. After all, most peasants who felt melancholy never left notes about it, but monks left pages upon pages describing their torments. In a way, the monastery preserved not just prayer but also an archive of mental struggle. One quirky tidbit: some manuals suggested that the best cure for acedia was to take a walk in the garden and get fresh air. Yes, even in the 12th century, people realized nature heals. Another remedy: reading holy texts aloud to drown out the intrusive thoughts. Basically medieval CBT, change your inner narrative with better stories. But there was also a darker side. Imagine being the monk who confessed acedia too often. He risked punishment, suspicion, or even expulsion. Some monasteries kept records of brothers who lost their wits and wandered off, never to return. Others buried such men quietly, labeling them as victims of the devil. To the community, these breakdowns weren't just personal. They threatened the very spiritual purity of the order. As you circle the cloister again, you overhear two monks whispering about Brother Thomas. He's been silent for weeks, refusing food, barely speaking. One insists he needs stricter discipline, the other pleads for mercy, saying perhaps Thomas is simply ill. That argument, discipline or compassion, echoes through history. And standing there, you feel how precarious medieval mental health care truly was, swinging between kindness and condemnation, prayer and punishment. Night falls over the monastery and the brothers gather for compline. Their voices rise in plain chant, steady and slow. The sound vibrates in your chest, oddly soothing. You close your eyes and for a moment you understand why so many medieval people believed prayer itself could heal the mind. Music, rhythm, community. It all worked like therapy, even if they never called it that. Still, not everyone was saved by the chant. Some monks cracked under the pressure, their despair too heavy. And though the monastery tried to interpret everything through the lens of sin and salvation, you realize, behind the theology, these were just human beings wrestling with the same shadows that haunt us today. Loneliness, anxiety, hopelessness. The noonday demon never really left us. It just rebranded itself under new names. You leave the monastery behind, stepping out into the open air again, but the night doesn't feel calm. A shiver runs through you as the wind whistles between crooked rooftops. Somewhere in the distance, a scream echoes, too raw, too desperate to be just tavern brawling. Your feet draw you toward the sound, and soon you're at the threshold of a parish church, its heavy oak doors creaking as you push them open. Inside, torchlight flickers against vaulted stone, and the shadows seem alive. Tonight, you've wandered straight into one of the most dramatic and frightening responses to mental distress in the medieval world: the exorcism. You stand near the back as a family ushers in their son, his wrists bound loosely with rope. His eyes dart wildly, his lips moving in frantic mutters. He stumbles, then collapses, thrashing on the floor. His mother sobs that he has been seized by demons, that for weeks he's ranted about voices in his head, refused food and smashed crockery as if invisible hands compelled him. In another age, he might be diagnosed with epilepsy or schizophrenia. But here, under the vaulted ceiling of a 13th century church, he is possessed. The priest arrives, carrying a crucifix in one hand and a small vial of holy water in the other. He wears a grim determination as though stepping into battle. To him, this is exactly that, a battle not of flesh but of spirit. He kneels, chanting Latin prayers that roll through the nave like thunder. The boy's cries grow louder, his body arching as if the words themselves scald him. You feel the hairs rise on your neck. Whether or not you believe in demons, there's no denying the terror in this ritual. Historians still argue whether these possessions were primarily medical conditions misunderstood, or whether cultural expectations shaped the behavior itself. In communities where everyone believed demons could invade, was it possible that troubled minds manifested their pain through that shared language? In other words, did people act possessed because possession was the only way their suffering could be recognized? You let that debate swirl in your mind as the priest presses on. The ritual intensifies. Assistants bring forward relics, a saint's bone sealed in crystal, a scrap of cloth said to have touched the Virgin Mary. The boy's eyes fix on the objects and he howls. To the onlookers, this is proof. The demon inside him cannot bear the holy presence. To you, it might look like sensory overload, or a terrified young man convinced by everyone around him that he is no longer himself. One quirky detail you overhear. Sometimes priests use not just relics and prayers, but sharp smells, burning incense, even pungent herbs to drive out the spirit. The logic was simple. Demons hate foul odors, which is ironic, given that most medieval towns already smelled like open sewers. Maybe the demons were just picky. The priest sprinkles holy water, his chant rising in volume. "Exorcizo te," he cries, "I exorcise you." The crowd gasps as the boy stiffens, then slumps exhausted. His mother rushes forward, cradling him, whispering gratitude. Did the demon truly depart? Or did the ritual provide such psychological relief that the boy finally collapsed into stillness? Either way, the community believes a miracle has occurred. You notice something fascinating here. Exorcism wasn't just about healing the individual. It was about reassuring the whole town. Madness, after all, frightened people. It threatened order. By labeling it possession, then banishing the spirit, the priest restored stability for everyone. The boy's relief mattered, yes, but so did the crowds. You can almost feel the tension in the air break as people cross themselves, convinced that holiness triumphed tonight. And yet, not every exorcism ended so peacefully. There are tales of victims chained for days, denied food, even beaten in attempts to drive out spirits. One chronicle describes a girl who wasted away under such rituals, her demon never leaving. Others were branded witches instead of patients, facing trials and sometimes execution. The line between treatment and persecution was paper-thin, and it depended largely on whether your symptoms inspired pity or fear. You linger in the church as the family departs and a friar approaches you, eager to share his own view. He insists demons especially target the melancholic, the sad, the isolated, the weak of will. They slip into cracks left by despair. Listening, you realize how dangerous that idea could be. Imagine being told your depression isn't just illness, but an open door for the devil. Talk about pressure. No wonder some sufferers spiraled further, unable to shake the sense that their own sadness invited eternal damnation. Still, not everyone in the medieval church leaned solely on exorcism. Some theologians argued that prayer, confession, and penance could soothe a troubled soul without dramatic rituals. A kind confessor might listen patiently, assign light penances, and reassure the penitent that despair was forgivable. These quieter moments, though less theatrical, may have done more actual good. A reminder that even in the harsh medieval landscape, compassion existed alongside severity. Out in the square the next day, townsfolk gossip about the night's exorcism. Some swear they saw smoke rise from the boy's mouth as the demon fled. Others say they heard a second voice speaking through him. Was it true? Was it rumor? You can't tell, but you sense how quickly stories spread, cementing possession as fact in the minds of the community. And for the family, that belief brought real relief. Their son wasn't broken beyond hope. He'd simply been attacked and healed through holy power. That framing, however flawed, gave them something precious: meaning. Here, another odd tidbit. Not only humans, but also animals were sometimes thought to be possessed. Records mention exorcisms performed on cows that refused to give milk, or pigs that behaved erratically. You imagine a weary priest sprinkling holy water on a squealing hog, and you can't help but chuckle. Even livestock, it seemed, were swept into the medieval battle for souls. As twilight returns, you glance back at the church. The torches are out now, the doors barred. Yet inside, the stones hold echoes of cries, chants, and whispered prayers. You realize that for medieval people, mental distress was never just internal, it was cosmic. A clash between heaven and hell fought out in the fragile vessel of a human body. Whether or not demons were real, the suffering certainly was. And the rituals, terrifying as they seem, were born of desperate attempts to bring order to chaos. You step back into the cool night air, your thoughts lingering on the boy who slumped in his mother's arms. Was he cured? Was he still tormented? You'll never know. But you carry with you the sense that in the Middle Ages, madness often spoke with the voice of a demon, and healing came in the language of faith, ritual, and fear. You leave the echo of the exorcism behind, stepping away from the church into the pale dawn. The streets are quiet now, merchants only just stirring, shutters opening one by one. You wander past an apothecary's stall, its shelves heavy with bundles of dried herbs, jars of curious powders, and vials glinting like liquid jewels in the light. If the monastery represented prayer and confession, and the church embodied exorcism, then here, in the apothecary's den, you see another side of medieval attempts to heal the troubled mind. The world of folk medicine, herbcraft, and what we might call early psychiatry, though no one then would have used that word. The apothecary greets you with a nod, his apron stained with plant resins and his fingers dusted green from pounding leaves. Behind him, a mortar and pestle rest like well-worn tools of battle. He boasts that he has remedies for every ailment of body and soul, headaches, fevers, melancholy, and the strange behaviors that make families whisper cursed. A woman enters, wringing her hands. She explains that her husband has been in a dark mood for months, sleeping too much, refusing to eat, staring into the fire as though his spirit has drifted away. The apothecary listens with surprising patience. He doesn't call it demonic. Instead, he mutters about imbalances of the humors, that ancient framework inherited from Greek and Roman medicine. According to this theory, the body, and by extension the mind, was governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Too much black bile, he insists, produces melancholy. Too much yellow bile brings rage. You watch as he gathers remedies. He offers her dried St. John's wort, a plant still today linked to easing depression. He mixes a little valerian root, good for calming restlessness and sleepless nights. He ties the bundle neatly with twine, instructing her to steep it in warm wine before bed. His advice feels surprisingly modern, and you realize, while the framework of humors may seem strange, the practical herbs sometimes truly helped. The apothecary shows you more. A jar of powdered skull, yes, actual human bone ground into fine dust, once believed to carry the strength of the departed. He pulls out poppy resin, thick and dark, an early form of opiate to dull pain and perhaps soothe the frantic mind. He warns, though, that too much leads to dangerous stupor. In another jar lies mandrake root, twisted into shapes that resemble little humans. Mandrake was famed for its supposed magical scream when pulled from the ground, but here it serves another role, a strong sedative. As you examine the shelves, you sense how blurred the line was between medicine, superstition, and magic. An herb might be chosen not only for its physiological effects, but for its symbolism. Rosemary to strengthen memory, sage to drive away evil, lavender to calm the heart. Sometimes prayers were murmured over the mixture, invoking saints to bless the remedy. In this way, healing became a blend of science, ritual, and faith. The apothecary leans close, whispering that not all his remedies are legal. Some nobles request charms soaked in opium. Others want love potions, which he suspects are really for soothing troubled relationships rather than sparking romance. He smirks as he reveals a vial of aqua mirabilis, a distilled tonic of herbs and alcohol, strong enough to make even the gloomiest man laugh for an evening. You suspect it's little more than early brandy, but you nod respectfully. After all, sometimes laughter really is the best medicine. A parchment tacked to the wall catches your eye, a copied recipe from Avicenna, the great Persian physician whose works were translated into Latin and spread across Europe. Avicenna described the nervous system with remarkable accuracy for his time, and his medical encyclopedias included notes on sadness, fear, and mania. Here in this little shop, medieval Europe's intellectual inheritance from the Islamic Golden Age is alive and well, helping shape treatments for the mind. Yet the apothecary admits he cannot help everyone. Some patients wander his shop muttering incoherently, frightened by visions. For them, Herbs only soften the edges. Others sink into such deep despair they refuse to swallow even the simplest tonic. For those, he sighs, only time, or divine intervention, may bring change. He has learned to accept the limits of his trade, though he clings to hope that each new herb or imported spice might unlock another secret. The market around you bustles now, and you notice that remedies for the mind aren't confined to shops. Women sell sachets of dried flowers as charms against nightmares. A wandering peddler offers music cures, claiming a lute's melody can lift melancholy. In some villages, healers use chanting, rhythmic drumming, or even dance to shake free a person's darkness. You can almost hear the echo of feet stamping on wooden floors, people clapping in time, trying to dance sadness out of their bones. But not all folk cures were so gentle. Some recommended cold baths in rivers to shock away melancholy. Others suggested purging with strong laxatives, believing black bile must be expelled physically. Even bloodletting, the drawing of blood with leeches or knives, was prescribed to balance the humors. You shudder at the thought of a weakened, depressed soul made weaker still by such treatments. Curiously, you learn that diet was considered central to mental health. Too much rich meat, too much wine, and the mind could grow clouded. Light, simple meals of vegetables and grains were said to restore balance. The apothecary himself promotes honey in warm milk for troubled sleep, a recipe that wouldn't feel out of place today. And then there were the charms, little scrolls of scripture tucked into pouches, hung around the neck to guard against madness. Some bore the names of saints like Dymphna, patroness of mental illness. Others carried mysterious symbols drawn from older pagan traditions. To the medieval sufferer, these weren't contradictory. Christian and pagan, science and superstition could all mix, so long as they brought comfort. You pause to reflect on something important. While modern minds might scoff at powdered skulls or charms, these remedies were often rooted in care. Families sought them because they wanted their loved ones well. Communities supported them because they feared madness but also pitied it. Even when treatments seemed crude, behind them lay genuine human concern. Before you leave, the apothecary offers you a final lesson. He points to a small, worn book of case notes, his own journal. Inside, he has recorded each patient, their symptoms, and the remedies tried. Some improved, some did not. He shrugs, admitting he is still learning. That humility, you realize, makes him less of a sorcerer and more of a scientist groping toward understanding in a world that lacks the words psychology or psychiatry. Stepping back into the sunlight, you carry the scent of herbs on your clothes. You imagine how many lives have been soothed by these earthy remedies, and how many others remain beyond their reach. For the medieval mind, healing came not from one source but from many: church, monastery, market, and home. The apothecary's stall stands as a reminder that even in a time of superstition, people sought practical, natural ways to ease mental suffering. And as you walk away, you can't help but think, had you been alive then, with your own moments of stress, sorrow, or sleepless nights, you might well have found yourself here too, clutching a bundle of herbs and hoping they carried just enough magic to mend the soul. The sun climbs higher as you leave the apothecary's fragrant den behind. But instead of heading back to the noise of town, you find yourself drawn to the road that snakes out of the city gates. The path is dusty, worn by countless feet, and today it is alive with travelers. You fall into step among them, realizing quickly that this is no ordinary crowd. Some limp, some carry bundles of bones wrapped in cloth, some clutch children to their chests, and many wear an expression that is neither entirely hopeful nor entirely broken, something in between. You have joined a medieval pilgrimage, one of the most common ways that people sought healing for troubled minds. The man beside you explains in a low voice that his daughter has been plagued with voices, sometimes singing, sometimes screaming, since the spring. Local priests tried holy water. The apothecary brewed herbs. Nothing has worked. Now they are walking more than 100 miles to the shrine of Saint Dymphna, the Irish martyr who, he swears, has cured madness before. You notice that the girl walks silently, her face blank, her eyes darting to invisible corners of the air. Further ahead, you see a woman whose grief has hardened into silence. Her husband whispers that she has not spoken since their infant died. He grips a crude wooden cross tightly, certain that touching it to a saint's relic will loosen the grief's cruel grip. Pilgrimages were not just vacations for the pious. They were journeys of desperation. In a time when doctors had little understanding of mental illness, when priests offered exorcism but not always relief, and when neighbors whispered of curses, many families turned to the road. The belief was simple: traveling to a holy site, enduring hardship along the way, and praying before a saint's relic might summon divine healing. As you walk, you catch sight of the landscape itself becoming part of the treatment. Meadows stretch wide, birds wheel overhead, and the road leads you away from suffocating towns. There is something in the rhythm of footsteps, the shared meals, the chanting of prayers that begins to soothe even you, an outsider. Some historians still argue whether the very act of pilgrimage, fresh air, exercise, community, offered a kind of therapy, regardless of relics and miracles. By nightfall, you and the pilgrims gather at a roadside inn. Here, the stories spill out. One man swears his brother was freed from melancholy after bathing in the waters at Canterbury, near the shrine of Thomas Becket. Another boasts that his wife found relief at Compostela in Spain, where St. James was said to walk invisibly among the sick. Someone even whispers that a trip to Jerusalem itself once calmed a nobleman's fits of rage, though skeptics mutter that perhaps the nobleman simply enjoyed the sunshine and diet of olives. And then comes the quirky tale, told with a chuckle by an old pilgrim with a scarred cheek. He insists he once saw a woman who carried a bottle containing the fingernail of St. Mary Magdalene. She claimed that sniffing it daily kept her from despair. Imagine that, he laughs, healing by sniffing a saint's fingernail. You nearly choke on your bread, but you notice the others nod seriously, because in this world relics, however strange, hold power. The next day, you reach a wayside chapel, and here the drama heightens. Families press coins into the hands of priests, begging for a blessing. Some tie scraps of clothing to trees near the shrine, believing that the saint will touch the fabric and carry the sickness away. One mother pushes her wailing son toward the altar, insisting the child is plagued by demons. The priest anoints him with oil and whispers prayers, his voice trembling slightly, as though unsure whether he's curing a possession or just calming a tantrum. You realize that pilgrimage wasn't only about relics, it was about spectacle. Imagine walking for days, arriving exhausted, then witnessing torches, chanting, the smell of incense, the shimmer of gold reliquaries. The sensory overload itself could jolt the mind. Sometimes that shock broke a cycle of despair. Other times it deepened the sense of awe and fear. Scholars today debate whether many miracle cures were psychosomatic. Did the sheer expectation of healing bring relief? Could the placebo effect already have been at work, centuries before scientists named it? Historians still argue whether we should take medieval miracle accounts literally or read them as expressions of hope, layered with exaggeration. You press closer to see a relic yourself, a finger bone encased in crystal, said to belong to a long-dead saint. Pilgrims gasp as a blind woman touches it and claims she sees faint light. Another swears his melancholy has lifted after kissing the reliquary. Whether or not miracles are real, you feel the collective hope humming in the air, and hope itself is a potent drug. The pilgrimage continues, and you notice the community it builds. Travelers share food, carry one another's burdens, and listen patiently to stories of sorrow. For someone lost in mental distress, this companionship alone could offer a lifeline. It reminds you faintly of modern support groups, not a cure, but a comfort. And yet not every tale is hopeful. Some pilgrims die along the road, too weak to endure. Others return home unchanged, their minds still tormented. You overhear bitter whispers. The saint refused us. Families sometimes viewed failure as divine judgment. Perhaps the sufferer's sin was too great, or perhaps the prayer was not fervent enough. Imagine the cruelty of such a thought, to walk hundreds of miles only to conclude your child's madness was your fault. Still, for every tragic tale, another pilgrim insists on success. And so the cycle of hope endures, generation after generation, long enough that even centuries later people remember certain shrines as centers of healing. In Geel, Belgium, the cult of Saint Dymphna grew so strong that the entire town became famous for housing and caring for the mentally ill, a rare pocket of compassion in a world that often locked them away. Families there welcomed sufferers into their homes as boarders, giving them dignity and daily life rather than chains. This quiet revolution sprouted from pilgrimage. As your journey nears its shrine, you sense how layered these pilgrimages were. Physical exercise, spiritual fervor, social support, and occasional exploitation. Priests collected offerings, relic sellers hawked dubious bones, and inns profited from weary travelers. And yet, beneath the commerce and spectacle, there was a real hunger for relief from suffering. A hunger so deep that entire villages might save for months just to send one relative walking. Finally, you arrive at the shrine. Candles flicker. The relic glows faintly in its case. The afflicted kneel, some shaking, some silent. The air is thick with incense and whispered prayers. You kneel too, not because you expect a miracle, but because you feel the weight of centuries pressing down. Countless people seeking healing, countless tears shed, countless hands laid on cold stone. Whether or not the saints answered, the act of reaching, of walking, of believing, was itself part of the cure. As you rise, you can almost hear a voice reminding you, sometimes healing isn't only about medicine. Sometimes it's about the journey, the hope, the community that carries you when your own mind cannot. Shrine fades behind you, candles dwindling to tiny points in the distance as you follow the road back toward the city. But this time, instead of rejoining markets and apothecaries, you drift toward a darker quarter, where the smell of rot and sewage thickens and tall stone walls cast long shadows across narrow streets. Here, tucked behind gates that groan like the jaws of a beast, stands an institution that has already begun to earn a reputation, though its true infamy will grow louder in centuries to come. You have found yourself at the threshold of one of the early hospitals for the mad, a forerunner of what will later be called Bedlam. The word hospital may mislead you. In your own century, hospitals are places of antiseptic walls, beeping machines, and bustling nurses. In medieval Europe, a hospital was less about cures and more about containment. It was often run by religious orders, designed to shelter the poor, the sick, and the unwanted altogether. A patient with a broken leg might lie beside a beggar, who lay beside a woman deemed mad, who in turn might lie beside a pilgrim simply too exhausted to move another step. Charity, not science, was the guiding principle. The porter at the door eyes you suspiciously, but after a coin passes from your hand to his, you are allowed inside. The air hits you first, damp straw, sweat, unwashed bodies. The hall is long, arched, echoing with coughs, mutters, and occasional screams. You notice beds lined up against the wall, though some are little more than pallets stuffed with hay. Chains dangle from one corner. Your footsteps crunch on rushes scattered to mask the stench. A man rocks back and forth in the nearest bed, muttering prayers to himself. Across from him, another bellows insults to invisible enemies. A young woman has scratched the plaster with her nails so fiercely that her fingertips are raw. No one seems surprised. For the attendants, these are daily sights. You realize quickly that this place serves less to heal the mind than to hide it away. Families unable, or unwilling, to care for a relative might deliver them here, paying a small fee to the institution to manage them. The hospital thus became both refuge and prison, depending on perspective. Still, not everything you see is cruelty. A nun moves between beds, offering bowls of thin broth. She hums softly, trying to soothe one patient's agitation. A physician, quill in hand, scribbles notes about another's fits of mania, recording symptoms as best he can. He recommends a regimen of purging and prayer, a combination that seems both harsh and hopeful. There is beneath the confinement a genuine attempt, however limited, to understand. You overhear a conversation between two visitors. One insists the mad are here because of sin, and only repentance can free them. The other counters that madness is an illness like any other, though the humors have slipped badly out of balance. Historians still argue whether medieval hospitals leaned more toward punishment or compassion, and standing here you feel the tension. Both impulses seem alive in these walls. A guard approaches you with a grin, gesturing for you to follow. Reluctantly you do, and he leads you to a barred cell at the far end of the hall. Here behind the door sits a man of noble birth, his gown finer than any other's. His family could not allow him to wander the streets raving, nor could they keep him safely at home. So they placed him here, where at least his body is guarded. You notice his chains are lighter, his bed cleaner, proof that wealth softened the edges of institutional care. In Bedlam and its precursors, status often determined treatment. The poor were tied, the wealthy restrained with velvet cords. Same confinement, different fabric. Back in the main ward, a jester in motley clothes strums a lute, entertaining both attendants and patients. At first you think this cruel mockery in the house of the broken, but then you see patients smiling faintly, one clapping along, another humming. The jester's foolishness seems to cut through the gloom. Music therapy, medieval style. Yet you cannot ignore the darker aspects. Some patients are displayed to visitors for a fee, their wild behavior treated as spectacle. You catch a group of city folk peering through the bars, pointing and laughing as if they were at a carnival. The boundary between care and entertainment blurs uncomfortably. Later centuries will turn Bedlam into a tourist attraction, where Londoners paid pennies to gawk at the mad. But even now, in this early stage, you sense the seeds of that cruelty sprouting. A physician beckons you to watch a treatment. A patient writhes on a bench, muttering about devils gnawing his brain. The doctor orders leeches applied to his neck, hopping to draw out excess blood and calm his frenzy. Another patient is given a draught of wine infused with hellebore, a powerful purgative. Both treatments aim at restoring humoral balance, though whether they restore sanity is doubtful. You wince as the patient retches violently into a bucket. Still, the physician defends his work. He explains that humoral theory is not merely superstition but observation. He has seen patterns. Patients with yellow bile often rage. Those with black bile often sink into melancholy. His treatments may not cure, but he insists they offer relief. You want to argue, but you realize that in this world without microscopes or neurology, his reasoning is logical. A curious tidbit reaches your ears. Some physicians experimented with music tuned to certain modes, believing harmonies could realign a troubled brain. One even claimed to cure melancholy by forcing patients to watch comedies until they laughed. Imagine that, prescribing Monty Python, if only it had existed then. The hospital bell tolls and attendants herd patients into a side chapel. Here, priests chant psalms urging the mad to join in. Some do, voices shaky but earnest. Others weep. A few sit silently, staring at the crucifix. Prayer here is less about exorcism than about routine, a way of grounding restless souls in familiar rhythm. Whether or not it works, the structure itself offers a fragile thread of stability. You linger by a window, the iron bars cold beneath your hand. Outside, life bustles freely, vendors shouting, children playing. Inside, time feels heavy, the hours marked only by meals and prayers. You imagine what it must feel like to live here indefinitely, cut off from family, branded as other. Some patients will never leave. Others may recover enough to return home, though always shadowed by whispers. As evening falls, you reflect on the paradox of this place. On one hand, it cages the vulnerable, sometimes cruelly, sometimes for convenience. On the other, it represents an early acknowledgement that mental illness exists, that it requires space, structure, and care distinct from ordinary sickness. It is both a step backward and a step forward, charity tangled with confinement. Before you leave, the nun presses a sprig of rosemary into your hand. For remembrance, she says softly, and for the troubled mind. You tuck it into your cloak, the scent sharp and grounding. As the gates creak open and you step back into the night, you carry with you the voices, the chains, the laughter, the psalms. You cannot decide whether this hospital is a place of mercy or misery. Perhaps you think it is always both. You leave the hospital's echoing halls behind, the sound of chains and prayers still lingering in your ears. The street outside feels almost too bright, too loud, too alive after the dim interior. Yet you realize that not all who wrestled with troubled minds ended up in monasteries, shrines, or hospitals. Some lived in a far stranger and more public spotlight, the courts of kings. You follow the winding road until it opens onto a square where banners flap in the breeze, and the air smells of roasted meats and spiced wine. Trumpets blare, and you are swept into the swirl of a royal procession. Brightly dressed courtiers bustle past, their jeweled sleeves catching sunlight, their voices dripping with gossip and laughter. And in the midst of this dazzling display stands a figure whose presence is both tolerated and feared: the fool, the jester. At first glance, he seems ridiculous, bells jangling from his cap, a wooden mock scepter in his hand, his grin stretched wide. But as he leaps into the path of a duke and mocks his gait, the crowd roars with laughter. The duke reddens but does not strike. Why? Because this jester enjoys a strange immunity. He is licensed madness, a liminal figure who can say what others dare not, wrapped in humor's protective cloak. It is here, in the space between entertainment and insanity, that the medieval world blurred the lines of mental health. Kings and nobles kept fools not only for amusement but, oddly enough, for wisdom. Their absurdity often cloaked sharp insight. One chronicler even noted that some rulers trusted their jesters more than their advisors, since fools speak truth under cover of folly. You notice how the jester's wildness, his unchecked tongue, is accepted, even valued. In another setting, he might be chained in bedlam. Here, he stands beside the throne. But jesters were not the only ones at court whose minds were questioned. You hear whispers about nobles who suffered melancholy, long absences from feasts, fits of rage, or sudden tears. The chroniclers rarely called it mental illness. Instead, they spoke of black bile, mad humors, or divine punishment. Some kings, historians argue, displayed what today might be called depression, bipolar disorder, or even psychosis. Yet in the medieval mind, such conditions were interpreted through lenses of sin, sainthood, or strategy. You drift closer to the throne, where a king reclines, his eyes heavy-lidded. Courtiers gossip that he sometimes retreats for weeks, refusing counsel, refusing food. They call it melancholy, a noble affliction. Oddly, melancholy carried a certain prestige in intellectual circles. Philosophers claimed it sharpened genius, that the very imbalance which crushed ordinary men might inspire poets and thinkers. A strange consolation prize, but a consolation nonetheless. Across the hall, another nobleman storms about, his temper fierce, his words slurred with wine. Some mutter he has too much choler, that fiery yellow bile. Others whisper more darkly, possession. In the court, the line between eccentricity and illness was razor-thin, often defined by whether one's behavior amused the king or embarrassed him. The jester tumbles into your path again, this time mimicking the nobleman's rants. The hall erupts in laughter, but you notice the noble's hand twitching toward his sword. The king raises a hand, silencing all. In that moment, the jester's role crystallizes. He is both shield and mirror. He reflects madness back to the powerful, softening its sting with humor. And for some, that reflection offers relief. The nobleman, forced to laugh at his own fury, seems to sag with release. For one night at least, comedy has served as therapy. Still, you can't help but feel uneasy. What protected one man as court fool condemned another as madman. The same erratic behavior that bought bread in the palace could lead to shackles in the hospital. Historians still argue whether jesters truly enjoyed freedom or whether they too were prisoners, prisoners of role and performance. Was their madness tolerated because it was staged? Or were some genuinely troubled souls given sanctuary through entertainment? You remember a curious tidbit told by a scribe. A jester once convinced his king to cancel an execution by joking that the headsman's axe was too dull for royal dignity. The condemned man lived. In this story, humor healed not only the mind but the body. Imagine that. laughter as literal salvation. But the court was also a place of cruelty. Those deemed mad, without the protective costume of a fool, could be mocked, sidelined, or quietly locked away. Chronicles describe nobles afflicted by frenzy, hidden in remote castles, their names whispered but never written. Madness at court was both spectacle and shame. You drift toward the edge of the feast, where a minstrel sings of King Charles VI of France, remembered by many as Charles the Mad. The ballad recounts how he once believed he was made of glass, terrified he might shatter if touched. Courtiers wrapped him in blankets, protected him from bumps, and humored his delusion. Some historians see in his story a clear case of psychosis. Others suggest political rivals exaggerated his madness to undermine his rule. Here again, interpretation bends with power. Was he ill, or was he slandered? You realize how dangerous it was to show vulnerability in a palace where ambition sharpened like daggers. The minstrel shifts to another tale, this one lighter, of a jester who carried a bladder filled with peas, shaking it like a rattle whenever nobles quarreled. The absurd noise broke tension and coaxed laughter, turning potential bloodshed into silliness. The crowd chuckles, but you hear beneath it the truth. In a world with no therapy, no medication, sometimes only laughter stood between sanity and despair. You step outside the great hall into the cool night air. The court behind you still hums with revelry, the jester's bells faint in the distance. Here in the quiet, you reflect. Mental distress in the medieval court could doom or elevate, depending on context. A king's melancholy might be rebranded as genius. A fool's erratic behavior became entertainment. Yet a servant's same despair could mean banishment or worse. Class, costume, and circumstance defined madness as much as symptoms. And you think, not without irony, the court itself felt like a kind of bedlam, its shifting alliances, its sudden rages, its extravagant feasts masking deep insecurities. Perhaps the line between sanity and madness has always been thinner in palaces than anywhere else. As you walk back down the torchlit road, the image of the jester lingers. Half healer, half prisoner, both mocked and cherished. His laughter still rings faintly in your ears, and you wonder, in a world where madness was feared, perhaps the fool was the only one allowed to embrace it. You leave the court behind, the jester's bells still jingling faintly in memory, and make your way down a narrower path that leads into a quieter, more spiritual world. The torches of the palace fade, and soon you're walking beneath a canopy of stars, the air sharp with the scent of pine and cold stone. Ahead, a monastery rises on the hill, its walls plain and severe, its bell tower silhouetted against the night sky. Here, the noise of the world recedes, replaced by silence broken only by chanting. Inside, monks shuffle barefoot through candle-lit halls. Their heads are bowed, their voices low, yet their presence radiates a calm so profound you almost feel it pressing on your skin. And here is where you learn that in the medieval imagination, mental distress was often treated not with potions or prisons, but with prayer, ritual, and holy rhythm. You are ushered to the cloister, where an abbot explains that for many, what we might now call anxiety or depression was seen as a spiritual trial. The restless mind was thought to be tormented by demons or distracted from divine focus. One classic example was acedia, sometimes described as the noonday demon. It struck monks especially, fatigue, sadness, aimless wandering of thought. Historians still argue whether acedia was a spiritual sin, an early description of clinical depression, or both. But for the monks, its cure was clear: prayer, discipline, and community. You sit on the cold stone bench as the abbot describes their routines, hours of chanting psalms, alternating with manual labor in the gardens, copying manuscripts, or tending the sick. The rhythm itself was believed to heal. By filling every hour with sacred order, they hoped to bring peace to chaotic minds, and perhaps in its own way, this structure worked. Yet not all was serene. You overhear a brother muttering of visions, hearing voices in the night. In another setting, he might be dragged to an exorcist. Here, the monks gather round him, chanting louder, believing their prayer can drown out his tormentors. Sometimes they succeed. whether through suggestion, comfort, or coincidence. Other times, the brother must be secluded, his condition framed as either divine testing or demonic affliction. One quirky detail catches your ear. Monks sometimes prescribed holy reading as medicine. If a brother was downcast, he might be told to copy uplifting texts, to soak his mind in sacred stories. The belief was that the word itself had curative power, almost like a pharmaceutical for the soul. You picture shelves of manuscripts glowing in candlelight, each line inked with the hope of healing. The abbot takes you into the infirmary, a small chamber that smells of herbs. Here, spirituality blends with folk remedy. A novice stirs a concoction of valerian root, believed to calm troubled minds, while another prepares lavender and chamomile for restless sleep. It's an early form of holistic care, body soothed with herbs, spirit soothed with ritual. And while you know they lacked modern medicine, you can't deny the comfort of such tender attention. Still, there is a darker side. The monastery is also a place of harsh asceticism. You learn that some monks believed self-punishment could drive away intrusive thoughts or temptations. They wore hair shirts that itched constantly, whipped themselves with cords, or fasted until weakness set in. Pain, they thought, purified the spirit and silenced inner demons. Today, you might see it as harming rather than healing, but to them it was a form of mental discipline. You hear whispers of anchoresses, women who voluntarily walled themselves into tiny cells attached to churches, living in solitude for decades. Some were celebrated as holy visionaries. Others might well have been fleeing mental torment, finding in isolation both sanctuary and prison. Were they mystics or sufferers of extreme anxiety? Historians still debate. Back in the cloister, a monk offers you bread and cheese. He explains gently that to them, hospitality itself is medicine. A lonely mind finds healing and welcome in the simple act of being fed and sheltered. It strikes you that, while we often think of monasteries as severe, they were also some of the few places where the mentally distressed could find community instead of exile. As the night deepens, you are led into the chapel for vigils, the midnight prayer. Candles flicker, shadows ripple across carved stone, and the voices rise in unison, low and steady. You feel your own breathing slow, your thoughts aligning with the rhythm. And for a moment, you understand why some found relief here. Not every troubled mind was healed, of course, but the act of being held in sacred structure, of losing oneself in chanting and routine, had its own quiet power. You drift outside afterward, the cold air biting but refreshing. The stars above burn steadily as though watching. You realize the monastery offered medieval people something beyond medicine. It offered meaning. To interpret suffering as part of a cosmic drama, whether trial, temptation, or path to holiness, gave it shape. Without that, distress might feel like senseless torment. With it, even anguish became a chapter in salvation's story. But as you descend the hill, you can't help but note the contradictions. For every brother comforted by chants, another was tormented by strict silence. For every novice calmed by lavender, another lashed himself bloody. Healing and harm lived side by side, bound by the same belief that the soul and mind were inseparable. The road curves back toward the world of laypeople, where not everyone had access to monastic care. Yet you carry with you the sound of chanting, the smell of herbs, and the curious sense that perhaps, just perhaps, the monks stumbled upon a truth, that structure, rhythm, and community can sometimes steady even the most restless mind. You leave the calm of the monastery behind, stepping back into the streets of the city, where cobblestones glisten from a recent rain and the faint smell of wood smoke lingers in the air. Here, the world feels less orderly, less predictable than the cloistered halls, yet it hums with life. Markets bustle with vendors hawking fish, cloth, and bread, while children weave through the crowd, squealing with laughter. And among this chaos, you notice how the city itself shapes mental well-being, or distress, in ways the monastery never could. In medieval cities, crowded living conditions, poor sanitation, and scarcity of food created stressors as real as any spiritual trial. Narrow alleys trap heat and filth, Waste runs in open gutters, and diseases like the plague or dysentery lurk in the shadows. Historians still argue whether environmental factors, smells, overcrowding, constant noise, contributed to what people called madness, or if cultural framing dominated perception. Whatever the cause, you feel it pressing on your senses. You walk past a tavern where laughter and music spill into the street. Inside, a young man sits slouched at the corner, staring at a tankard of beer as if it contains the answers to a riddle he cannot solve. Some call his demeanor melancholy, others mutter that he is possessed or cursed. In medieval cities, visible signs of distress, screaming, rocking, or muttering, could draw attention quickly. Sometimes the response was compassionate, neighbors bringing food or calling for a healer. Other times it was harsh. The local authorities might confine someone in stocks, chain them in a cell, or even banish them from the city. You see a group of children playing near the well, laughing and throwing stones into the water. One boy suddenly breaks from the group, muttering to himself, his movements sharp and erratic. Mothers hiss warnings. One woman claims he is touched by a spirit. Another insists he must have eaten something spoiled. Medieval urban life left little room for unexplained behavior. It demanded an explanation, and explanations were often framed in terms of morality, religion, or the unseen. Walking further, you enter a narrow alley where a man crouches against a wall, mumbling incomprehensible words. He clutches a wooden staff and pigeons bob around him cautiously. Some call him a prophet, others whisper madman. Yet you notice the subtle rhythms of his movement, the way his gaze tracks the passing clouds. This is a man navigating his own world, forced to survive in the unforgiving machinery of the city. Here, survival itself becomes therapy, and yet also a form of punishment. You pause by a small apothecary tucked into a corner. The shop smells of herbs, dried flowers, and vinegar. Inside, the healer mixes remedies for sleeplessness and sadness. Chamomile, hops, and lavender for relaxation, pennyroyal and sage for focus, occasionally stronger tonics containing opium or henbane. Herbs are sold to the worried, the sleepless, and the disturbed. Some are consumed for physical relief, others for psychological comfort. Quirky as it seems, many believe that carrying a sachet of dried rosemary or thyme in the pocket would protect against madness. You hold a sprig in your hand, and imagine the medieval mind linking scent, memory, and hope. Beyond the markets, the city's guild halls draw your attention. Artisans, scribes, and merchants gather, their chatter forming a subtle background hum that fills narrow streets. Guilds often offered support networks, a precursor to communal care. Apprentices could turn to masters for guidance when mental strain threatened their work. Guilds provided ritual, structure, and accountability, all protective factors for those vulnerable to despair or agitation. Historians still debate whether urban guild life genuinely alleviated mental distress or merely created social expectations that masked symptoms. You find yourself by the river, watching it wind between stone bridges. Fishermen haul nets, their movements steady and rhythmic. Some of the mentally distressed are drawn to the water, whether to escape the city's heat, meditate on its flow, or even attempt more dangerous acts. The river is both a source of livelihood and a peril. A boy once claimed he could hear voices in its current. Some said he was mad, others holy. You can imagine the blurred line between divine inspiration and neurological disorder in a world without medical science. Crowds form near the town square where a traveling preacher is addressing the masses. His voice booms over wooden platforms. Sin brings suffering, repentance brings relief. Some mentally troubled individuals are drawn to his words, others flee. Yet you notice how the preacher's rhetoric itself acts as a kind of intervention. For the faithful, belief in divine causality and remedy can reduce fear, anxiety, and despair. For skeptics, it may amplify stress. Either way, religion shapes urban mental health as much as air, food, and labor. You turn a corner and encounter a small chapel dedicated to Saint Vitus, where locals believe dancing in rhythm can cure Saint Vitus dance, a disorder characterized by involuntary movements and trembling. People call it both spiritual and medical. A young woman twirls slowly, encouraged by neighbors, her shaking lessened through exertion and ritualized movement. You watch, fascinated, as the community itself becomes therapist, using dance, music, and attention to guide the body and mind back toward balance. Food is another subtle form of treatment. In urban homes, bread, broth, and pottage sustain, but also serve as medicine. Malnutrition was rampant, and poor diet could exacerbate mental strain. Wealthier citizens consumed wine, cheese, and spices imported from distant lands, which, though luxurious, could also comfort or stimulate. Scholars still debate how much diet influenced mood and behavior, but for the medieval city dweller, it mattered both physically and socially. Sharing bread with neighbors could heal the soul as well as the body. By nightfall, the city grows quieter, torches flicker and shadows lengthen. You find a spot on a low wall overlooking the river, listening to distant bells and the soft lap of water. The urban environment, harsh and crowded as it can be, has its own subtle therapies. Rhythm of labor, community rituals, attention from neighbors, moments of beauty in architecture or nature. And yet, without relief or care, the same streets can intensify despair. The medieval city is a stage for mental struggle, a crucible in which suffering and survival intertwine. You close your eyes briefly, imagining the lives of the men, women, and children who inhabit this urban landscape. The beggar muttering to pigeons, the artisan hammering late into night, the mother singing to a sleepless child. Each negotiates their own mental terrain, drawing on herbs, prayer, ritual, and community, often simultaneously. There is no single cure, no single method, only adaptation, resilience, and hope in whatever form is available. And as you rise and continue your walk through the wet streets, the city seems to hum with energy and fragility, a living organism filled with minds both tormented and resilient, all finding their way in a world that has yet to understand the inner workings of the human psyche. You leave the busy streets behind and find yourself drawn to the countryside, where the air is clearer and the horizon stretches wide under an expansive sky. The contrast is immediate. No bells clanging from market towers, no merchants shouting, no crowd pressing around you. Instead, you hear wind through reeds, the distant lowing of cows, and the occasional call of a bird. Here, in villages and rural manors, you encounter a very different approach to mental distress, one grounded in home, family, and folklore rather than hospitals or courts. You walk along a dirt path that winds between thatched cottages. Smoke curls from chimneys, carrying the scent of wood smoke and baking bread. Villagers pause to nod or wave. One elderly woman, leaning on a gnarled staff, beckons you closer. She explains that her grandson has been seeing things since the last full moon, faces in the shadows, voices in the cornfield. The family has tried prayers, charms, and herbal remedies, but nothing seems to quell his unease. In this setting, remedies are a patchwork of folk medicine and ritual, often blending superstition with observation. A neighbor might recommend carrying a piece of iron in your pocket to ward off evil, or sprinkling salt across thresholds to keep unseen spirits at bay. Herbs, sage, rue, vervain, are crushed and steeped in boiling water, and sometimes combined with prayers or verses spoken aloud. Some concoctions are designed to calm, others to provoke purging or sweating, intended to restore balance to body and mind alike. You notice the subtle social dimension here. The community participates in the healing. Villagers gather for midwife-led cures, potions prepared under the gaze of experienced hands, chants recited as each herb is added. Everyone has a role. Even storytelling functions therapeutically. Tales of saints and heroes battling their own trials are whispered to the troubled, offering hope and perspective. Historians still debate whether these community rituals genuinely altered behavior or merely reinforced conformity. But for those involved, the act of participation often brings relief. You walk past a small wooden bridge over a creek, where a young man sits, tossing stones into the water. He appears lost in thought. The villagers explain he suffers from melancholia, caused, they say, by an imbalance of humors. The remedy here is practical: diet, exercise, and work in the fields. Daily labor, fresh air, and structured activity are believed to correct the excess black bile that causes despair. You note the echoes of monastic discipline in this secular environment: ritualized, structured activity serving both body and mind. One peculiar folk tale reaches your ears. A local healer once claimed she could draw out sadness by whispering into a rabbit's ear, then releasing it into the woods. Strange as it sounds, families swear it worked. The child laughed again within days. You smile at the image, though you understand the principle. Attention, ritual, and belief can be profoundly calming, even if the cure seems absurd. The family's grandson, restless in the sun, is taken by the healer to a patch of wildflowers. She gathers chamomile, lavender, and thyme, weaving them into a small crown. She explains that wearing the crown during the day protects the mind from intrusive thoughts. While you might laugh, you notice the boy's shoulders relax slightly, the tension easing. Small rituals like this, anchored in sensory experience, demonstrate an early understanding that attention, touch, and smell influence mental states. Nearby, an elderly man prunes an orchard. Villagers note that he too suffered episodes of anxiety, which he calls the fog in my head. His cure is work in the fresh air, tending the trees, listening to the birds, observing the seasons. There is a rhythm to rural life that provides stability. Scholars still argue whether such labor genuinely alleviated mental distress or merely distracted, but you sense a quiet efficacy. Purposeful engagement, aligned with nature's cycles, eases the restless mind. Food, as in the city, plays a subtle role. Fresh bread, dairy, and seasonal vegetables nourish not just the body but the psyche. Overindulgence in heavy meats or ale is discouraged. Families understand intuitively that what the body consumes can alter mood. Honey-sweetened drinks, nettle teas, and infusions of calming herbs are prepared daily. You notice how much attention is given to taste, aroma, and warmth, sensory experiences designed to soothe both stomach and soul. Children, too, are treated with gentle ingenuity. One boy, prone to fits of anger, is encouraged to chase chickens across the yard or pound grain in the mill. The combination of exercise, fresh air, and repetitive labor is seen as both practical and therapeutic. You realize this is a form of occupational therapy centuries before the term existed. Physical action, combined with supervision and social structure, guides energy that might otherwise manifest as destructive thought or behavior. As evening approaches, the village gathers in the square for communal prayer. A traveling priest recites a short homily, emphasizing patience and divine protection. Even the healer's rituals are framed in the context of faith. Her work is seen as a partnership with God. The combination of religion, routine, labor, and community forms a holistic approach to mental health, organic, adaptive, and deeply human. You linger by the hearth of one cottage, feeling the warmth of the fire against your face. The family shares bread and stories, and for a moment the world seems calm and comprehensible. You notice that care is not provided by a single professional, nor is it formalized in institutions. It is woven into daily life. Observation, attention, ritual, and social support form a network of therapy. The sick are neither locked away nor constantly medicated. They are watched, guided, and integrated into ordinary routines. Yet not all is perfect. Tragedy can strike without warning. Sudden illness, accident, or a bad harvest can exacerbate mental strain. And still, the methods you've witnessed, ritual, labor, herbs, story, and social attention, offer something no modern hospital can: a profound sense of embeddedness. Here, the mind is not separated from life. It is inseparable from the rhythms, seasons, and people around it. As night falls, the village quiets. Fires dim, animals settle in stalls, and the last smoke curls toward the stars. You walk out of the square, carrying the sense of a world where mental distress is recognized, responded to, and absorbed into everyday life. It is neither perfect nor entirely safe, but it is alive, adaptive, and human, a reminder that care can exist anywhere that attention, ritual, and community meet. The village fades behind you, the smoke from chimneys curling upward, carrying the faint scent of herbs and hearth fires. You follow a winding track that climbs gently into hills dotted with ancient stones and wildflowers, the kind of landscape where shadows stretch long in the evening sun. Here, the world feels quieter, slower, and yet, in its tranquility, you notice how the mind's unrest still finds ways to surface. This is the realm of wandering healers, local sages, and the mysterious practitioners who combined observation, intuition, and folklore to treat mental distress. You meet one such healer as you approach a small stone cottage surrounded by a wild garden. She is a woman of middle age, her hair streaked with silver, her hands gnarled from years of tending plants. Villagers speak of her with reverence. She can cure ailments that doctors cannot touch, or at least guide the troubled mind toward calm. You follow her into the garden, where chamomile, sage, rue, and wormwood grow in carefully tended rows. She crushes leaves between her fingers, inhaling deeply before grinding them into powders and tinctures. The mind, she says softly, is as fragile as the petals on these plants. It can be soothed, strengthened, and occasionally driven into clarity with care. Her voice is calm, her eyes steady, and you find yourself believing, if only for a moment, that she truly holds power over invisible currents of the soul. Her treatments are an intricate blend of observation and ritual. A man with bouts of rage might be led through a series of exercises, pounding herbs in a mortar to release tension, singing simple chants, and breathing in the aroma of lavender or vervain. Another patient, racked by melancholy, may be asked to lie on moss in sunlight, listening to the wind through the trees. You notice that this is both environmental therapy and psychological suggestion. The healer manipulates space, light, scent, and rhythm to induce calm. You witness a curious ritual that makes you raise an eyebrow. A young woman suffers from sleeplessness and frightful dreams. The healer places a small figurine under her pillow, a carved animal from wood, and whispers protective words. She insists that the figurine absorbs spirits that haunt the mind. You might chuckle, imagining this in a modern lab, but the effect is tangible. The woman's posture softens, her breathing slows, and by morning, she rests more peacefully. The placebo effect, centuries before it had a name, is alive here, intertwined with belief and ritual. Beyond herbs and talismans, the healer employs story as medicine. You sit by the fire as she recounts legends of saints, spirits, and ordinary humans who overcame despair. The rhythm of her voice, the cadence of her words, and the moral embedded in each tale act like a balm. Some historians still argue whether narrative truly alters brain chemistry, or whether its effects are entirely cultural. Yet you cannot deny the power of attention, storytelling, and ritual combined. They offer focus, empathy, and guidance to minds otherwise adrift. The healer also relies on observation and classification. She notes patterns in behavior, who responds to touch, to sunlight, or to specific herbs. She adjusts treatments based on subtle signs, a furrowed brow, a hand trembling slightly, or a sudden gleam in the eye. You realize that this is an intuitive proto-psychology, an understanding of human behavior without textbooks or microscopes, yet informed by centuries of trial, error, and oral tradition. You ask about more severe cases, those racked by fits of violence or obsession. The healer nods solemnly. Some are treated with restraint, though rarely chains. Others are guided through movement, ritual, or distraction. One man with uncontrollable shouting is placed near a brook, encouraged to speak his words into the flowing water, imagining the stream carrying them away. You watch him whispering to the current, his voice softening, tension melting from his shoulders. In this rural, pre-scientific world, metaphor and practice merge seamlessly. The brook becomes a therapist, the river a conduit for relief. Food, again, is part of the prescription. Bitter herbs for melancholy, warming broths for lethargy, lightly spiced teas to stimulate or calm. Each potion is tailored to the individual, and the act of preparation itself is therapeutic. The patient participates, engages the senses, and feels agency in the process. Scholars still debate whether dietary treatment had measurable impact or functioned more as symbolic ritual, but in practice, it creates structure, mindfulness, and expectation, all crucial for easing distress. You also witness a communal aspect. Neighbors often gather for healing sessions. A song, a dance, or a group blessing becomes a shared therapy. Participation, inclusion, and witnessing provide social reinforcement. Isolation, you notice, magnifies symptoms. Engagement mitigates them. Even centuries before psychology articulated these principles, the folk healers had stumbled upon them empirically. One quirky story reaches you. A man swears he was cured of obsessive thoughts by wearing a fox's tooth tied around his neck. The healer listens patiently, allows him to wear it, and within days he reports relief. Whether the fox's tooth had any intrinsic power is irrelevant. The belief, ritual, and sense of control bring measurable benefit. You smile, recalling pilgrims sniffing saints, fingernails, and monks chanting psalms. Humans have always needed symbols to anchor hope. Night falls over the hills, and the healer lights a lantern to guide you along the path. The moon casts silver light across the wildflowers, and the air smells of damp earth and herbs. You reflect on what you've seen. Rural healing combines attention, ritual, environment, and narrative. It is holistic, adaptive, and deeply human. It lacks hospitals, universities, and laboratories, yet it meets the needs of the mind with care, creativity, and community. As you leave the cottage behind, the healer waves, her shadow stretching long across the garden. You feel the lingering sense of presence, of observation, of ritual that soothes without chains, without apothecary bottles alone, without sermonized threats of sin. Here, the mind is treated as inseparable from the body, the community, and the natural world. And perhaps you think, there is a lesson for your own age. Sometimes healing comes not from knowledge alone, but from attention, ritual, and empathy woven into daily life. The countryside recedes behind you as you follow a faint track that winds into the shadowed edges of a dense forest. The air grows cooler, richer with moss and damp earth, and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures reminds you that this world operates on rhythms older than the city, older than the monastery, older even than villages with their cultivated fields. Here, in the deep woods and remote hamlets, you encounter a final thread of medieval mental health, the borderlands between medicine, magic, and superstition, where the mind's fragility is treated with curiosity, caution, and sometimes fear. A small clearing appears, and within it stands a cabin built of twisted timber, its roof sagging under moss and lichen. Smoke curls lazily from the chimney. You are greeted by a woman known as the Wise Woman of the Forest, her hands lined with age, her eyes sharp and lively. Villagers come to her with woes that modern medicine might solve with pills or therapy: sleeplessness, melancholy, obsession, inexplicable terror. But here, solutions are entwined with folklore, ritual, and intimate observation. "Come closer," she says, her voice low and steady. "The mind is a house. Sometimes the walls are crooked, the doors stuck, or the windows covered. We simply try to straighten them." You feel the weight of centuries in her words, a worldview that sees mental distress as something tangible, almost architectural, a disorder that can be repaired with careful hands and attention. You watch as she works with a young man, pale and trembling, claiming that voices whisper to him at night. The wise woman guides him to a circle drawn in the dirt, instructing him to kneel and recite prayers while she sprinkles a mixture of rosemary, rue, and lavender. The ritual lasts for hours, but it is not merely symbolic. It structures attention, focuses thought, and imposes rhythm. She explains that the circle itself represents a boundary, a space in which spirits, real or imagined, cannot enter. Whether the spirits are literal or metaphorical, the result is noticeable. The man's body gradually relaxes, his voice steadier, his gaze clearer. Stories reach you of more extreme measures. Some individuals accused of possession or witchcraft are subjected to trials involving sensory deprivation, exposure to fire or cold, or ritualistic confinement. While horrifying to modern eyes, these practices reflected a belief system in which the mind, body, and spirit were inseparable. Historians still debate whether such treatments caused more harm than good or whether, in some cases, ritualized structure genuinely reduced distress. Standing here, you understand the tension. Hope and fear, healing and danger coexist in this shadowed world. You notice how strongly community shapes outcomes. Villagers accompany patients to the cabin, offering support, witnessing rituals, and sometimes participating directly. A mother holds a trembling child while the wise woman performs an herbal treatment. A brother assists with the preparation of teas and poultices. Social presence, alone attention, touch, reassurance, acts as therapy, centuries before psychologists quantified the effect. In this sense, medieval magic and medicine were not purely mystical. They were social, cognitive, and sensory interventions packaged within cultural understanding. A curious detail emerges. Some forest healers use music or rhythmic sound as treatment. One tale describes a man plagued by anxiety, guided to a clearing where a shepherd plays a reed pipe. The repetitive, steady music, combined with the hypnotic sway of trees in wind and sunlight on leaves, soothes him. The healer calls it the song of the soul, and while the method sounds quaint, its principle is surprisingly modern. Rhythm, repetition, and sensory immersion can calm the nervous system. You also observe techniques resembling exposure therapy. A young woman fears darkness after a series of nightmares. The healer gradually guides her into the forest at dusk, exposing her to shadows and sounds incrementally. Each step is supervised, paced, and ritualized. By the end of several evenings, she reports feeling less terror, more grounded. You marvel at the intuitive understanding of fear, habituation, and structured exposure, all centuries before contemporary psychology formalized such methods. Food and drink remain integral. A tea of chamomile and mint calms the anxious. A poultice of marjoram applied to the forehead soothes agitation. A broth enriched with honey and ginger fortifies the body and stabilizes the mind. The healer carefully observes reactions, adjusting dosages, combining herbs, and integrating prayer and ritual. This is holistic care, practiced without modern tools but deeply attentive to the interaction of body, mind, and spirit. Sometimes the wise woman employs humor, surprising you with her levity. She makes the anxious young man mimic a crow, hopping and cawing, shaking off tension. Laughter erupts despite initial reluctance, and you notice how the act changes the room's atmosphere. Tension dissolves, rigidity softens, and the body relaxes. Humor, play, and imagination serve as therapy, bridging the gap between fear and ease. Yet danger always lurks. The forest is a place of isolation, where untreated mental illness can spiral unchecked. Stories of vanished wanderers, delirious villagers lost to rivers or bogs, remind you that the stakes were real. Treatment here is a mix of observation, ritual, herbs, social support, and sometimes sheer luck. Historians still argue how effective these methods were overall, but standing in this cabin, you sense their value. They provided containment, guidance, and hope where the city or monastery might have offered only structure or confinement. By nightfall, you leave the cabin, the healer's lantern casting long shadows across mossy ground. The stars shine brilliantly overhead, and the forest feels alive with watchful silence. You reflect on the spectrum you've witnessed: hospitals, courts, monasteries, villages, and now forest cabins. Each setting embodies a different philosophy of care, yet common threads emerge: attention, ritual, community, and respect for the individual's inner life. As you walk back to the main road, the wisdom of these forest practices lingers. Even without modern science, the careful application of sensory, social, and ritualized strategies produced tangible relief. You realize that in the medieval mind, mental health was inseparable from environment, society, and belief. Healing was not simply the elimination of symptoms. It was the restoration of balance, rhythm, and meaning. The forest thins behind you, replaced by rolling hills and meadows speckled with wildflowers and grazing sheep. The sun is low, casting gold across the landscape, and the air smells sweet with grass and the faint tang of river water. In this open space, you notice a different dimension of medieval mental health, the intersection of ritual, social order, and the beginnings of what might loosely be called proto-science. Here, experimentation, observation, and even debate inform approaches to the mind, creating a bridge between superstition, tradition, and emerging medical thought. You arrive at a small town known for its physicians and learned men, often called upon to treat both the body and the mind. Their workshops and apothecaries line the streets, filled with the smell of herbs, incense, and ink. The townspeople come seeking remedies for headaches, fevers, or melancholia. A young scholar greets you, dressed in a dark robe with ink-stained sleeves. He explains that some towns have developed a curious blend of classical knowledge and local tradition. They consult Galen's humors, Hippocratic texts, and local wisdom simultaneously, tailoring treatments to each patient. You follow him into a small clinic, where a man sits slouched on a wooden bench, head in his hands. His symptoms, a racing pulse, tremors, and intrusive thoughts, are described as an imbalance of humors, but the physician adds nuance. Perhaps a touch of bile, yes, but also a restless mind unoccupied, seeking chaos in the absence of work or prayer. Historians still argue whether physicians truly understood mental illness in a modern sense, or whether they merely extended humoral theory to behavioral observation. Either way, their attention is thorough, and their methods surprisingly structured. The scholar guides you to a casebook, handwritten and annotated, describing treatments and outcomes. Some are herbal, valerian for sleeplessness, rosemary to sharpen focus, or St. John's wort for melancholy. Others are ritualized, reading specific psalms, applying blessed oils, or engaging in meditative exercises. You notice that each approach blends observation, tradition, and imagination, an early acknowledgement that mind, body, and environment interact in complex ways. Curiously, some physicians experiment with exposure. A man with crippling fear of enclosed spaces is gradually guided from room to room, first for minutes, then hours, while the physician observes reactions, notes progress, and adjusts interventions. It is therapy framed in medieval understanding, yet remarkably similar in principle to modern exposure techniques. The scholar remarks, almost proudly, that even within their limited framework, careful observation and incremental adjustment can produce change. You wander through the apothecary, where vials of tinctures, powders, and infusions line the shelves. Some are labeled for physical ailments, others for mental strain, to calm the humors and quiet the mind. A small vial of lavender oil rests beside dried wormwood, valerian, and rose petals. You inhale the scents and feel a subtle shift, a reminder that sensory experience, smell, touch, taste, was integral to medieval care. The scholar insists that even today, scent can influence mood, showing the continuity between past and present understanding. But experimentation in this town also carries risk. There are tales of patients reacting poorly to stronger compounds, opium tinctures, henbane elixirs, and other potent substances. Some experience hallucinations, seizures, or worse. Yet within the town, careful note-taking, repetition, and discussion help refine approaches. Scholars debate, record, and cross-reference. Unlike the solitary forest healer or village ritual, this is a communal intellectual endeavor, a prototype of scientific method applied to the mind. You sit in a courtyard as the scholar recounts a peculiar experiment. A man suffering from persistent melancholy was assigned alternating tasks of labor, meditation, and storytelling. Each day's regimen was adjusted based on mood and behavior. Within weeks, his condition improved. You notice the underlying principles: structure, engagement, social support, and observation. Centuries before psychology formalized these techniques, they are being applied in a pragmatic, if sometimes inconsistent, manner. Curiously, the town also maintains a public space for communal exercise, music, and dance. A small group performs rhythmic movements, some mimicking agricultural labor, others enacting playful stories. Observers claim that these collective activities reduce tension, restore mood, and even foster moral behavior. You recall the village dances and forest rituals. You notice a repeating pattern. Human beings respond to rhythm, engagement, and social connection, regardless of the century or cultural framing. You also witness debate among the physicians themselves. One insists that excessive black bile causes depression. Another argues that poor diet and social isolation are primary factors. Historians still argue whether medieval scholars were on the verge of a proto-psychology, or whether these discussions remained philosophical rather than practical. Either way, intellectual engagement and discourse were central to mental health in this town. Knowledge was both a tool and a form of therapy, creating a framework for understanding that extended beyond ritual or superstition. A lighter, quirky practice emerges. Some patients are prescribed playful tasks like composing a poem or acting out a story as a form of therapy. Humor, creativity, and imagination are treated as curative, recognizing the mind's need for expression. You smile, noting how little has changed. Even today, therapists encourage creative outlets to relieve stress and build resilience. As night falls, lanterns flicker along the cobblestone streets, casting long shadows. The town hums softly with the closing of shops, prayers, and conversation. You walk along the quiet streets, reflecting on what you've seen. The combination of herbs, observation, structure, ritual, and debate forms a surprisingly sophisticated approach to mental health. It is imperfect, incomplete, and sometimes dangerous, yet attentive, adaptive, and deeply human. In this town, you realize medieval minds sought not just to control behavior but to understand it, nurture it, and integrate it into society. The remedies range from playful to serious, spiritual to empirical, whimsical to disciplined, all reflecting a nuanced approach to what it means to care for the human mind. And as you leave the town behind, the glow of lanterns fading into darkness, you sense a thread connecting every medieval space you visited. Care emerges from attention, ritual, rhythm, and community, in all their human complexity. The town's lanterns fade behind you as the road opens to rolling hills and a vast, twilight sky. You walk slowly, your boots crunching on gravel, the air tinged with damp earth and the faint smoke of distant hearths. This final leg of your journey through medieval mental health takes you to the threshold of understanding itself. How all the methods you've witnessed, from monastery chants to village herbs, from forest rituals to scholarly observation, coalesced into a vision of the human mind that is as complex as it is human. You pause by a small river, the water shimmering faintly under a crescent moon. You recall the monks chanting to structure the restless mind, the villagers blending story, labor, and herbs to soothe anxiety, the forest healers using ritual, sensory immersion, and social presence, and the town physicians experimenting with observation, diet, and debate. Each approach has its quirks, its strengths, and its dangers. Yet across these spaces, one constant emerges: the recognition that the mind is inseparable from the body, the community, and the environment. In the quiet of this night, you consider how medieval people understood distress. There were no diagnostic manuals, no MRI scans, no psychopharmacology. Instead, observation, ritual, structured activity, and attention were the primary tools. People sought meaning in suffering. It might be a spiritual trial, a humor imbalance, an intrusion of unseen spirits, or the natural consequence of social or environmental stress. Historians still debate which of these interpretations dominated reality versus perception, but to those living it, the reasoning mattered less than the hope it provided. You imagine a young woman from the village, her hands clasped over a bundle of herbs, listening to a story that mirrors her own inner struggles. Or a monk, exhausted from labor and prayer, sensing a rhythm that quiets the disordered thoughts in his mind. Or a man in the town, guided by a physician's structured observation, gradually recovering from melancholy through diet, exercise, and careful attention. Each is navigating the fragile architecture of thought, emotion, and belief. Each is seeking stability in an unpredictable world. Even the more unusual methods, the ones that make you smile or raise an eyebrow, fit into a coherent logic of care. Wearing fox teeth, whispering to rabbits, dancing in rhythm, or reciting protective prayers. These are all interventions designed to structure attention, instill hope, or create a sense of control. To the medieval mind, the unseen forces shaping the soul or psyche demanded engagement, ritual, and sensory involvement. In effect, the mind was treated as an ecosystem, fragile, responsive, and deeply embedded in the surrounding world. You wander along a worn track lined with wildflowers, feeling the cool air on your face. It strikes you that medieval approaches to mental health, for all their limitations, were surprisingly holistic. They incorporated body, spirit, environment, and society. They recognized that isolation intensifies distress, that rhythm and structure calm turbulence, that attention and ritual shape perception. Even humor, creativity, and storytelling were tools of therapy, centuries before modern science formalized these insights. Curious, you recall the tension in each space you visited. The monastery disciplined the mind through labor and prayer. It comforted some, traumatized others. Villages nurtured the disturbed through social rituals and herbs, yet occasionally superstition led to fear and blame. Forest healers offered freedom, attention, and engagement, but isolation posed risks. Town physicians experimented and debated, but potent remedies could harm if misapplied. The common thread is clear. Care is human, imperfect, adaptive, and often intertwined with risk. As you approach the top of a small rise, you glimpse the vast landscape stretching into darkness, dotted with villages, rivers, forests, and cities. You realize the medieval approach to mental health is a tapestry woven from human ingenuity, imagination, belief, and empathy. Each method, whether rooted in prayer, labor, ritual, or experimentation, sought to restore equilibrium, to reconcile mind, body, and environment. You understand, perhaps for the first time, that medieval people were not naive. They were observers of human behavior, experimenters in their own way, and creators of spaces where care could flourish. The wind shifts, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers. You pause, letting the silence settle. There is no final answer, no definitive cure, no universal method. What survives across the centuries is the insight that attention, rhythm, community, ritual, and belief all shape the mind. Whether through a monastic chant, a village dance, a forest ritual, or careful observation in a town, medieval mental health was about understanding the human spirit, not merely suppressing symptoms. You start your descent down the hill, the stars bright overhead, and you feel the weight of what you've learned. These centuries-old methods may seem foreign or quaint, yet the principles resonate. Humans have always needed attention, structure, and meaning to navigate their inner lives. You carry the echoes of chanting, the smell of herbs, the rhythm of labor, and the warmth of communal care with you. And in that awareness, you feel a quiet reassurance. Across time, humans have always sought to understand and care for each other's minds. As the night deepens, the landscape softens, shadows lengthen, and your breathing slows. You might feel a gentle tension easing from your shoulders, the mind's chatter drifting to the background. Imagine the monks' candlelight flickering, the villagers' fires glowing warmly, the forest healer's lantern casting long, gentle shadows across moss and stone. Each place, each person you've encountered leaves an imprint, a quiet reminder that care can exist in many forms, and that attention, ritual, and companionship soothe the restless mind. Let yourself sink into this calm. Hear the wind whisper through the trees, the distant river flowing steadily, the faint murmur of a village preparing for rest. Let your imagination drift to the gentle rhythm of work, prayer, and play that shaped so many lives centuries ago. Even when methods seem strange or quaint, the underlying truth persists. Structure, engagement, social presence, and sensory attention bring relief. Perhaps you picture yourself walking along that twilight path, feeling the earth beneath your feet, inhaling the crisp night air, and noticing the stars reflected in quiet waters. Allow each step, each breath, each small sound to lull you into ease. You've traveled centuries in thought, observed minds and hearts navigating fear, sorrow, and confusion, and you've witnessed humanity's enduring attempt to understand itself. Now, as you settle into the quiet of your own space, imagine the voices of the past softly fading, leaving you in gentle stillness. The candlelight dims, the winds soften, and the world holds its breath with you. Carry the calm forward, letting it rest in your mind and body. Let go of the day's weight of distractions, of noise, and sink into the rhythm of quiet, peaceful thought. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let yourself ease fully into night, knowing that across centuries, humans have always sought comfort, understanding, and care, and you are part of that continuing story. Sweet dreams.